You're really playing with fire when you decide that, hey, let's hand something over to the federal government to protect liberties. That usually doesn't work out well. And I remember a few years ago during the Trump years, where the many conservatives decided that now was the opportunity to pass federal laws forcing reciprocation on state governments, or reciprocity, whichever term it is they use for that, where one state has its own gun laws and you have a concealed carry permit, for example, in that state. Not all states recognize that. So let's pass federal laws then regulating what all states can do in terms of recognizing the right, the legal right, to own a gun or use it or carry it in some fashion. And of course, we at Mises.org said, well, if you do that, you're basically just granting then the federal government control over carrying guns, owning guns, and you can have a future administration come back and then reverse that. And you just say, well, during the Trump years, we established that the federal government regulates who can carry guns in what states. And so now we decided things have changed. And now we're not going to allow that anymore. And we as the federal government, now that we're in control of that, we decide you're not allowed. And that's, of course, always been the temptation with the Supreme Court as well, is that a lot of rulings for the Supreme Court essentially have the effect of a constitutional amendment. And so that rather than having an actual constitutional amendment process, which requires a supermajority, as you noted, and which in the 20s was the totally accepted process of changing anything to the Constitution. In fact, if you look back in the 20s legislatively, you can see tons of failed amendments that were tried and failed. Some of them related to child labor. A big deal was the child labor law that would have basically made it illegal to have your children do chores. And that's one reason that failed. Especially agricultural areas were very much opposed to that. But once it failed, it wasn't, hey, let's go to the Supreme Court and get them to make a ruling that says that child labor is bad. In fact, it was just, well, I guess there's nothing we can do now because the amendment process failed. But by the 60s, certainly by Roe v. Wade, right, it was accepted that, well, we can just define anything we want as having a federal role in the constitutional process. So now why bother with a constitutional amendment? Just go get the Supreme Court to rule on something, or this process that both you and I noticed during COVID, just have the federal government seize a new power, and then maybe the Supreme Court will get around to telling us we can't do it. We'll just try our chances. And so it as long as you're just sitting around saying that, well, it's such an important issue, gun ownership, that we should have the federal government be in charge of it, it just seems like that's asking for trouble. And yet we received a lot of pushback when we basically took the McClanahan line and said, no, the federal government should not be forcing reciprocity on these governments. But I received emails, for example, saying, well, that's crazy. You have to have uniform laws nationwide because if I'm driving from one state to another, I become a felon when I go from state A to state B. Well, they're making really, in many ways, a similar argument to what the left is going to now argue, why you need to have federal control of gun laws, which is that, well, I can buy a gun in Ohio and then I can travel, I can drive to New York State and then use that gun on New Yorkers. So therefore, we have to have nationwide gun control. But the issue of federalism is just accepting that people in different places do things differently. But because guns are such a cultural issue, it looks like you're going to have a hard time convincing a lot of people of that.